The Texas sky stretched wide and endless, painted in soft shades of gold and rose as the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills. On the sprawling Callahan ranch, the wind carried the scent of dust, hay, and horses, mingling with the faint memory of spring blossoms that once grew near the porch. Jack Callahan leaned against the worn wooden post outside his house, his hat pulled low over his brow, staring at the horizon with the heavy silence of a man who had learned to carry grief as naturally as breathing. Life had carved deep lines into his rugged face, not just from the hard work of tending cattle under scorching suns and storm-filled skies, but from the emptiness that lingered after his wife's death. She had been the heart of this home, the laughter at the table, the warmth in the evenings. Without her, the ranch still stood, but it no longer felt alive. Inside the house, little Emily sat on the floor near the hearth, her small hands clutching a faded shawl that once belonged to her mother. The shawl was worn thin, its lavender scent barely clinging to the fibers, but to Emily it was a treasure beyond all else. She pressed it to her face, inhaling deeply, as though breathing in her mama's presence. Her wide blue eyes, so much like her father's, carried the innocence of childhood but also a sadness far older than her years. She glanced at her father often, watching him with quiet curiosity, as if hoping to see some sign of her mama in him. Jack entered the house with heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. He paused when he saw Emily sitting there, so small and fragile, and his chest tightened with both love and guilt. He knew she deserved more laughter, more gentleness, more than a father who spent his days battling cattle and loneliness. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Time for supper, darlin'," he said softly. His voice was rough from disuse. For most days the cattle heard more words from him than people did. Emily nodded and carefully folded the shawl, placing it beside her as if it were something sacred. At the table, the two of them sat across from each other, the silence heavy between the clinking of spoons against tin bowls. Jack tried to smile at his daughter, but the weight of responsibility always pressed hard against him. He remembered his wife's laughter, the way she used to make even a simple meal feel like a feast, and the memory burned at him. Emily poked at her food and whispered, "Mama used to sing at supper." The words struck Jack like a knife. He looked away, swallowing hard, unable to meet his daughter's gaze. After supper, Jack carried Emily to her bed, tucking the quilt around her small frame. She reached for the shawl, clutching it to her chest. "Papa," she whispered, "when I dream, Mama is always smiling." "Do you dream of her too?" Jack's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her that yes, he dreamed of her every night, that sometimes he still reached out in the dark expecting to find her beside him. But the words lodged in his chest, too heavy to release. Instead, he kissed Emily's forehead and whispered, "Sleep now, little one." When Emily drifted into slumber, Jack returned to the porch, sitting on the steps with the night air cool against his face. The stars began to prick the sky one by one, silent witnesses to his grief. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl upward like fragile whispers fading into the night. He thought of the ranch, of the fences needing mending, the cattle needing tending, but most of all, he thought of Emily and the hollowness in her young life. She needed more than a tired father who didn't know how to fill the aching void her mother had left behind. As the crickets sang in the grass and coyotes howled in the distance, Jack bowed his head into his hands. The ranch was a place of work and survival, but without love, it was only land and fences. He prayed silently, though he hadn't prayed much since his wife passed, asking for strength, asking for something or someone that could bring light back into their home. He didn't know that fate was already moving, and that soon a knock at his door would change everything. The storm rolled in quickly that evening, the kind of Texas storm that darkened the sky in minutes and whipped the wind across the plains until the cattle grew restless in their pens. Jack had been outside checking the fences when the first drops fell, heavy and sharp, drumming against his hat brim. By the time he made it back to the porch, the rain had turned into a curtain, blurring the horizon and swallowing the sound of everything but thunder. Inside, Emily sat on the window seat, watching the sky crack open with wide-eyed wonder. Hugging her mama's shawl tight against her chest, Jack had just latched the door when the sound came soft at first, then louder. A knock. He froze, not sure he had heard it over the storm. Few folks ever came this far out, and certainly not in weather like this. Then it came again, faint but clear. A knock, followed by a hesitant voice calling, "Hello? Please, anyone?" Emily's head shot up. "Papa," she whispered. "Someone's out there." Jack's hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the wall. Out here, strangers were met with caution, especially in the dark of a storm. He opened the door slowly, lantern in hand, the warm glow spilling into the wet night. Standing there on the porch was a young woman, soaked through to the bone, her dress clinging to her and her hair plastered against her cheeks. She looked weary, her eyes large and searching, but she stood tall despite the rain pouring down around her. "Please," she said again, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry over the storm. "I've been walking since morning. I only need a place to wait out the storm. I'll be gone by daylight." Jack studied her in silence, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. A stranger on his land, asking for shelter, was no small thing. But before he could speak, Emily appeared at his side, peeking around his leg. The girl's eyes, bright and curious, met the woman's, and something unspoken passed between them. Emily tugged on her father's coat and whispered, "Papa." "Let her in." "She smells like Mama." Jack stiffened, glancing down at his daughter in surprise. He caught the faintest trace of lavender rising from the woman's wet dress, the same scent his wife used to wear when she dried wildflowers on the windowsill. The memory hit him like a blow, and for a long moment, the storm outside was no louder than the pounding of his own heart. With a sigh, Jack stepped aside. "Come in," he said gruffly. The woman gave a small nod of gratitude and stepped into the warmth of the house, dripping water onto the wooden floor. Emily, fearless as only a child could be, ran to fetch a blanket from her bed and brought it to the woman, who knelt down and wrapped it gratefully around her shoulders. "Thank you, sweetheart," the woman said softly, her smile gentle despite her exhaustion. "My name's Clara." Emily beamed at the kindness in her voice. Jack, however, remained standing, his arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. "Clara, huh?" he muttered. "You travelin' alone?" She nodded. "Headed west. Looking for work, maybe a place to start fresh." Her words were simple, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of sorrow, something Jack recognized but chose not to ask about. He motioned toward the table. "Sit, I'll get you something warm." As Clara sat, Emily climbed onto the chair beside her, still clinging to her mama's shawl but now sneaking curious glances at the stranger. Clara noticed and reached out with a smile. "That's a pretty shawl," she said. "Did your mama make it?" Emily's lips trembled as she nodded. "It still smells like her." Then she added in a whisper, "So do you." Clara's eyes softened, and she looked up at Jack, who turned away, busying himself with the kettle. He didn't want her to see the crack in his composure. The storm raged on outside, but inside the little ranch house, something shifted. Clara sipped tea with grateful hands. Emily leaned close as if she had known her all her life, and Jack sat across from them, his gaze guarded but his heart unsettled. He told himself it was only one night, that she would leave when the storm passed. But deep down, some part of him knew the moment his daughter had whispered those words, "She smells like Mama," that things would never be the same again. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air fresh and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling across the Callahan Ranch like gold. Clara stood at the window, gazing out at the wide, endless land, her borrowed blanket still draped over her shoulders. For the first time in weeks of wandering, she felt something she hadn't dared hope for: peace. Behind her, the soft sound of a skillet crackling reached her ears, and when she turned, she saw Jack at the stove, frying eggs with an expression that suggested this wasn't his usual task. Emily sat at the table, swinging her legs and humming faintly. When Clara entered, the little girl's face lit up like dawn. "Good morning, Miss Clara," she chirped. Clara couldn't help but smile back. Jack glanced over his shoulder, his hat tipped low as usual. "Didn't figure you'd still be here," he muttered. Clara hesitated before replying. "I was going to leave, but the little one asked me to stay until breakfast." She glanced at Emily, who nodded earnestly. Jack said nothing, only set plates on the table and sat down with them. The meal was quiet, save for Emily's chatter about the ponies in the pasture and how one of them always tried to nibble on her hair. Clara laughed softly, and Jack found himself listening to the sound. It was warm, unforced, the kind of laugh that filled empty corners. After breakfast, Clara offered to wash the dishes. Jack tried to refuse, saying, "You're a guest," but Clara simply rolled up her sleeves. "I've never been good at sitting idle," she said, and before long the sink was full of suds and Emily was standing on a stool beside her, handing her spoons and humming happily. Jack stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene with a frown that wasn't truly a frown. It was confusion, perhaps even longing. The house hadn't looked this alive since his wife had passed. As the day stretched on, Clara proved herself useful in more ways than one. She noticed the loose stitching on Emily's dress and offered to mend it. She cooked a hearty stew with spices Jack hadn't tasted in years. She even hummed while sweeping the floor, a tune that reminded Emily so much of her mama's lullabies that she begged Clara to sing it aloud. Clara did, her voice soft and soothing, and Jack, passing by the open window, paused to listen, his chest tightening at the sound. Emily followed Clara everywhere, as though afraid she might vanish if she let her out of sight. When Clara went to gather eggs from the coop, Emily trotted at her heels, telling her stories about her favorite calf. When Clara brushed out her hair in the evening, Emily sighed contentedly, resting her head against Clara's knee. "You smell like Mama," she whispered again, and Clara's heart nearly broke with the tenderness of it. Jack noticed the bond forming and tried to keep his distance. He spent long hours outside, fixing fences, tending the herd, anything to avoid the stirring emotions he didn't want to face. Yet every time he returned, he caught glimpses of Clara's patience, reading to Emily by the fire, teaching her how to braid, kneeling down to wipe dirt from her cheeks after she tumbled in the yard. These were small things, but they filled the house with warmth Jack hadn't realized he missed so badly. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in amber, Jack found Clara on the porch, mending Emily's dress with careful stitches. "You don't have to do all this," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up at him, her eyes calm but steady. "I want to," she replied simply. "She needs a woman's hand, and you need a little help." Jack bristled at the truth of it but said nothing. Instead, he sat beside her, watching the thread slip in and out of the fabric. For the first time in a long while, the silence between him and another person didn't feel heavy, it felt easy. Emily, curled up with her shawl nearby, watched them with a sleepy smile, as if her little heart already knew what Jack's stubborn one refused to admit. By nightfall, Clara had sung Emily to sleep with another gentle lullaby. Jack lingered in the doorway, listening as his daughter's breathing grew soft and steady. He looked at Clara, sitting there with the lamplight glowing on her hair, and realized with a start that he wasn't dreading tomorrow anymore. Against his better judgment, against every wall he had built around his heart, bonds were forming not just between Clara and Emily, but between Clara and himself. The days rolled by with an ease Jack hadn't felt in years. Clara's presence had become part of the rhythm of the ranch, her voice drifting through the house, her careful hands at work in the kitchen, and her laughter mingling with Emily's in the yard. It was almost too good, almost fragile, like a dream Jack feared would vanish if he reached out to hold it. And as with most dreams, reality came knocking when he least expected it. It happened one afternoon in town. Jack had gone to the general store for supplies, and Clara had insisted on coming along with Emily. She had dressed simply, in a plain calico dress, her hair pinned back, but there was no disguising the grace in her manner or the softness in her eyes. Emily skipped ahead between the shelves, holding Clara's hand, as though she belonged to her. For Jack, the sight stirred something warm in his chest, though he kept his expression as guarded as ever, but the townsfolk noticed too. Whispers followed them, curious eyes watching the widowed rancher and the unfamiliar young woman at his side. Jack ignored them, used to being the subject of gossip, but Clara's shoulders stiffened. She kept her chin high, though Jack caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. It was near the counter when a voice rang out, sharp and cutting. "Well, I'll be." "If it isn't Clara Dawson." Jack turned, his jaw tightening. A stout man with a red face and thinning hair leaned against a barrel, smirking. "Didn't reckon I'd see you again." "Thought you ran off for good." Clara froze, her face paling. Emily clutched her hand, confused by the sudden tension. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You know her?" he asked, his voice low, edged with warning. The man chuckled darkly. "Know her? Everyone around these parts knows her story. Worked herself near to death as a maid for the Dawson family. Ran off one night, left without a word. Folks said she was too proud to stay in her place, too ashamed to admit she didn't belong." He spat on the floor, his words dripping with scorn. "Now she's showing up with Callahan here. Guess some women can't stop running." Clara's lips trembled, but she held her silence. Jack's hand clenched into a fist, his temper rising like a storm. He stepped forward, his voice a growl. "That's enough." The man faltered at the steel in Jack's eyes but smirked again before shuffling off, leaving behind a trail of whispers. Clara stood still, her hands shaking. Emily pressed against her, whispering, "Don't listen to him." But Clara's eyes were downcast, shame written across her face. Jack finished his purchase quickly, his jaw set tight, and they left town without another word. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the only sound the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle. Emily eventually fell asleep against Clara's side, but Jack's thoughts were far from peaceful. The man's words gnawed at him. He had worked hard to keep scandal and trouble away from his daughter. Could he risk letting someone with a shadowed past stay under his roof? That evening, Clara lingered on the porch while Jack put Emily to bed. When he returned, he found her staring out at the horizon, her hands twisting in her lap. "I should go," she whispered. Jack's chest tightened. "Go? After what that fool said in town? You believe his gossip means more than the truth of who you are here?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. "You don't understand. Rumors stick. They'll follow you. They'll follow Emily. I can't let her—" her voice broke. "She deserves better than the weight I carry." Jack stepped closer, his shadow falling over her in the lamplight. "Emily don't care about rumors. She cares about how you braid her hair, how you sing her to sleep, how you make her smile. That's what she sees." His voice softened, though it still held the rough edge of honesty. "But me, I have to think about what's best for her. And I can't decide that if you're fixing to run every time your past catches up." Clara flinched at the words. She looked away, her jaw trembling, and finally whispered, "Then maybe I should leave before I cause more harm." She turned as if to step off the porch, but the sound of small feet stopped her. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching her shawl, eyes wide and filled with tears. "Don't go," she pleaded, her little voice breaking in the quiet night. "Please, Miss Clara, you smell like Mama. If you leave, it'll be empty again." Clara's breath caught, and Jack's heart twisted at the raw truth in his daughter's words. He saw the fear in Clara's eyes, the pain she carried, but he also saw the bond already too deep to deny. Still, he said nothing, caught between duty and desire, protection and hope. The shadows of the past had fallen across their fragile peace, and Jack knew the hardest choices were still ahead. The tension lingered in the Callahan house like a storm cloud refusing to pass. Clara had stayed after Emily's plea, but the look in her eyes told Jack she was still preparing herself to leave. She worked quietly, humming as she cooked and keeping busy with chores. Yet there was a hesitation in her movements, as if she were only half-rooted. Jack noticed it every time she avoided his gaze, every time she folded her hands in her lap as though bracing for judgment. He wanted to tell her she belonged, but the words stuck in his throat, tangled with his fear of trusting too easily. That night, as if the heavens themselves sensed the unrest, a real storm swept over the plains. The wind howled like a beast, rattling the shutters, while lightning split the sky in violent flashes. Jack had been dozing in his chair when he heard the first sharp crack outside fence posts snapping like matchsticks. His heart dropped. The cattle. He leapt to his feet, grabbing his coat and boots. Clara appeared at the doorway, her face pale but steady. "What is it?" she asked. "Fence is down," Jack said, already reaching for his lantern. "Cattle'll scatter in this weather." Before he could tell her to stay inside, Clara was pulling on her shawl. "You'll need help." Jack hesitated, torn between protest and urgency, but there was no time. He nodded curtly, and together they rushed into the storm. The rain lashed against them, soaking through clothes in minutes. The lantern's light barely pierced the sheets of water, but Jack knew the land by heart. They reached the broken fence just in time to see a group of cattle pushing through the gap, bellowing in fear. Jack cursed under his breath and ran to herd them back, shouting over the wind. Clara followed without question, her skirts dragging in the mud as she waved her arms, and called to the animals with surprising confidence. Emily's pony had bolted near the edge of the pasture, tangled reins caught on a post. Clara spotted it and dashed toward the frightened animal, murmuring soothing words as she struggled with the knot. Lightning flashed, illuminating her soaked figure, determined, fearless. Jack felt a surge of something sharp and unexpected in his chest. Admiration. By the time the cattle were rounded up and the gap temporarily mended, both of them were drenched and shivering. Jack's muscles ached, his breath ragged, but he couldn't take his eyes off Clara as she guided the pony back to the stable, her hands gentle, her voice calm despite the chaos. She moved with a strength he hadn't anticipated, not the strength of brute force but of steady courage. When they finally stumbled back into the house, Emily was waiting, wide-eyed and trembling. She ran to Clara first, throwing her arms around her waist. "I was so scared," she cried. Clara knelt down, brushing the wet hair from Emily's face, whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart. We're safe now." Jack stood by the door, dripping water onto the floor, his heart pounding with more than exertion. He saw the way Emily clung to Clara, the way Clara held her as if she had always belonged there, and something in him shifted. He realized the man in town had been wrong. Clara wasn't running from her past, she was running toward a future, one she was brave enough to fight for even in the storm. Later, when Emily had fallen asleep curled against Clara's side, Jack sat across from them, the fire casting flickering light across the room. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "You didn't have to do what you did tonight. But you did. You saved more than cattle out there." Clara looked up, surprised, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. "I only did what needed to be done." Jack shook his head. "No, you showed me something. You showed me you've got grit. And you showed Emily she can trust you. That means more than anything. His voice faltered, softer now. I was wrong to doubt you. Clara's breath caught, her lashes glistening in the firelight. For the first time since the whispers in town, some of the weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. She nodded, her voice low. Thank you, Jack. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was warm, filled with unspoken understanding. Jack leaned back, watching Clara stroke Emily's hair as she slept. In that moment, he knew he couldn't deny it any longer. The stranger who had come knocking in the storm wasn't just a guest. She was becoming the piece of their lives they hadn't even known they were missing. And for the first time in years, Jack began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the loneliness that haunted the ranch was finally lifting. The ranch felt different now, not just because of the laughter that lingered in the air, but because of the quiet understanding that had grown between them all. Cole, once a man of silence and walls, found himself standing at the threshold of something he had never dared to dream again: family. He had spent years convincing himself that life was only about work and survival, that love and companionship were luxuries he couldn't afford, not after fate had taken his wife. But the way Emily had filled the house with warmth, and the way little Mary clung to her as if she had been sent straight from heaven, shattered every belief he once held. That evening, the three of them sat together on the porch. The sun was painting the horizon in orange and gold, casting a soft glow over the fields that seemed endless. Mary nestled between them, her little hand in Emily's while her head leaned against her father's arm. Cole glanced sideways at Emily, noticing the tiredness in her eyes but also the peace that accompanied it. She didn't just belong here, she fit, as though she had been part of their story long before she stepped onto their ranch. Mary stirred, looking up at Emily with those innocent eyes that always spoke louder than words. You smell like Mama, she whispered again, her voice gentle, like a prayer she wanted to keep repeating. Emily froze for a moment, her throat tightening, before she smiled down at the little girl and pressed a kiss on her forehead. She had no words, only tears that brimmed but didn't fall. Cole's heart clenched at the sight. He had never seen anyone so naturally step into the place of motherly love Mary craved, and he knew in that moment he couldn't let Emily walk away, not now, not ever. Later that night, after Mary had fallen asleep with her tiny fingers still wrapped around Emily's scarf, Cole found himself lingering in the kitchen while Emily tidied up the dishes. He watched her move about, simple tasks somehow transformed into acts of grace when she did them. He wanted to speak, but the words lodged in his throat. He had been a man of action his whole life, not words, but now words mattered. Finally, he stepped closer, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. Emily, he began, his voice lower than usual, rough with emotion. She looked up, startled, and waited. You've done more for Mary in these weeks than I ever thought possible. She's smiling again, laughing. She clings to you like... He paused, his jaw tightening. Like she's found her mama again. Emily's chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths. Cole, she whispered, unsure if she should interrupt, unsure what he was about to say. He ran a hand over his face, then let it drop as he stepped closer. I thought I was meant to live alone with my ghosts. But watching you with her, with us, I can't deny it anymore. You belong here, Emily, not just as someone helping out, not just as a friend. You belong with us, if you'll have us. Her eyes widened, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. The silence stretched between them, thick and trembling with unspoken feelings. Then she set down the dish she had been drying and took a step toward him. Cole, I never thought I'd find a place where I was wanted, truly wanted. But Mary, and you've given me more than I ever hoped for. Her voice broke as she whispered, I don't want to leave. Cole's relief was almost overwhelming, his chest loosening for the first time in years. He reached for her hand, rough and calloused fingers trembling as they closed around hers. It wasn't just gratitude or companionship in that touch, It was love, raw and new, but steady as the land beneath them. From that day forward, the ranch was no longer a place of solitude but of healing. Emily became part of every sunrise, every shared meal, every story told by the fire. Mary's laughter filled the air, brighter than ever, because she now had both a father and a mother's love. And Cole, the man who once believed love had passed him by, finally allowed his heart to rest. When neighbors came by, they noticed the difference too, the way Cole smiled more easily, the way Mary danced about with joy, the way Emily moved with confidence as if she had always been the mistress of the home. Whispers turned into congratulations, and soon enough, Cole and Emily made official what their hearts had already known. They were a family. On the day of their small wedding, Mary tugged at Emily's dress with a grin. "Now you're really Mama," she said with pure certainty. Emily knelt, tears of joy running down her face, and hugged her tightly. Cole stood beside them, his heart full to bursting, knowing that his little girl had been right from the very beginning. She did smell like Mama. She was Mama, and together they would build a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise that none of them would ever be alone again.